Wallace Herndon Smith was a 20th century American artist. Born in the spring of 1901 and the first of 3 children to Lida and J. Herndon Smith, the roots of Wally's family run deep in the rich history of St. Louis, Missouri. His mother Lida's side of the family was famously known for the philanthropic work of her uncle, Robert Brookings. In the 1800s, Brookings' vision, resources, and will established landmark institutions. Wally's father, J. Herndon, came to St. Louis from Chicago in 1899. He was a successful banker and president of A.G. Edwards and Sons before becoming the president of Smith Moore and Company.
And then they put together the Midwest Stock Exchange, which was in St. Louis. And it was a pretty big deal in those days. Now then they took it, as Chicago surpassed St. Louis, they took it and moved it. It went to Chicago.
Loved his father. He referred to his father, to me anyway, as Good Time Charlie. He said Dad would always try to take him out and show him a good time and let him have fun in life. His mother was more serious and sort of down to earth, and she sort of kept him on the straight and narrow, make sure he did his schoolwork and stuff like that. She was a little bit more of the disciplinarian in the family.
My great-grandmother Lida was, again, very matriarchal, and I think ran a very tight ship.
And Wally would say, you didn't cross Mom, but Dad, you get away with stuff.
And I can remember as a small child my grandmother saying Wallace. She called him Wallace all the time. Wallace, there's a bit of a chill in the air. And you go, oh, he groaned and head down for the coal shovel. And you could hear him banging around downstairs like some kind of a wild animal. So with the doors, the furnace smashing, and he groaning and whatnot, and Mom always giggling at his performance, which was part of the reason for it. He had a built-in audience with Sister Kate, as he called her.
The family's future was secure, and for Wally, his education began at Smith Academy, the Lawrenceville School in New Jersey, and ultimately Princeton, where the renowned Triangle Club gave the young artist a voice. Wally entered Princeton in 1920. These were highly productive and successful days. He was acting, writing, and composing music. He was social and funny, always a showman. His stage work had created a buzz, and to top it off, he was falling in love.
We met at a dance in Montclair. I thought I was quite Twinkletoes. I put on some fancy steps that lured her apparently, hence the pyramids, and here we are today.
Mary Alice Kelsey was a student at Vassar College. She was independent and strong, focused, and stunning.
This was his freshman year in college, and he was already quite a smash hit. And I've always liked people who were smash hits, so I pursued him, because he was this man he wasn't a man. He was all of 19 or 20, who was a big hit on the stage. I was terribly impressed.
Mac, dearest, I hate to grow sentimental in writing you this letter, but I absolutely cannot help it. There's no use of my beating around the bush any longer, and I've simply got to express my feelings. I think you're the sweetest, most wonderful girl I've ever known. Now please don't laugh at me, because I really mean every word of it. I was enraptured throughout the entire weekend, and I do nothing now but sit around and think of you. If you've ever been head over heels in love yourself, then you know what an irrational coma one is in, and will be able to understand my situation. This is no sudden affection that has come over me. The spark has been glowing for several years, and it took only a flash of those eyes to set it off.
Known throughout her life as Kels, she gave Wally a sense of balance.
Kels was always the calm kind of voice of reason in the house. As I said, Wally I just remember him as being very boisterous and, really always just very energetic. And she was very calm and very proper in her mannerisms, certainly around me. Whenever there was anything that needed to be organized, it was Kels that played that role.
In college, this was a long distance and long courtship, sustained mostly through written letters.
Mac, dearest, was extremely glad to get your letter yesterday and to learn that all is well at Vassar. Now that the grind has started down here, I begin to wish it was still summer. I suppose that's the way it always goes, however. I'm so damn busy with all the other things that I haven't cracked a book since I've been back. Will probably be thrown out on my ear in February. I should like nothing better than to take your sweet advice about overworking, but now that I've started this thing, I've got to see it through. It gets on one's nerves sitting in front of a typewriter from morn till night, but it won't be so very much longer now. Just between the two of us, the show looks good, but it may cost me a diploma.
The show was a musical comedy called Drake's Drum. In 1923, the New York Times provided a review. In those days, the Ziegfeld Follies were the premier variety show. Wally was offered a gig with the Follies by Ziegfeld himself. Wally passed.
I was offered a job in the theater in 1930-something, but Dad wouldn't let me take it, or didn't suggest that I take it.
Jimmy Stewart had said to him, that he thought he could make it. Wally wrote the score for a play called Ships That Pass in the Night in Princeton, and he wrote music and words and music, and he was an actor, and here were people that he had been associated who were all over the screen and getting all kind of recognition, in movies and history books, and I think sometimes he thought, that could have been me.
68 years later, 1 year after Wally's death, the Princeton Alumni Weekly listed key contributors in Triangle history.
He had a taste of Broadway and he didn't like it. He didn't like all the machinations that went on behind the scenes and the double crossing. He was too idealistic for that. He had this other thing in mind. He wanted to say what was in himself and not the lines that somebody provided to him. He wanted his own lines.
Wally decided to move away from theater.
I often wonder what it is to all this art and bunk I spend my time with. It may and probably does enrich our lives to a certain extent by giving us a little inward glow of satisfaction. I get terribly fed up of it all, and often come to the conclusion that the only real art is that of living quietly in the country on ham and eggs. And then I come to a passage of poetry like this, and I realize I'm wrong. Oh, to build, that is the noblest of all the arts. Painting and sculpture are but images, are mere shadows cast by outward things on stone or canvas, having in themselves no separate existence. But architecture, existing in itself and not seeming a something it is not, surpasses them as substance, shadow.
After graduation, he enrolled in the graduate architecture program at Princeton.
It's hard to tell whether I'll be a good architect as yet. I'm still rotten at the mathematical part and hate it, but I've overcome my sloppiness and developed a pencil technique that amazes even me myself.
Confident yet struggling, this passage from his letters provides insight.
I'm having a hell of a time with architecture from one standpoint. I can't be accurate. Everything has to be done to the fraction of an inch, and my pen always skips or the ink blots, and I get frustrated as hell. My houses are sometimes nice to look at, but the main objection offered to them is that it would be impossible to live in. I always forget fireplaces and furnaces.
In 1926, Wally concluded several years of courtship and married his beloved Kels.
His father said, if you're going to be an architect, you must have the best background possible. So we went and lived in Paris for a year. And all the time that he was supposed to be studying architecture, he actually was doing watercolors. That's what he actually wanted to be doing.
Watercolors occupy an interesting place in his body of work, I think. In terms of painting, watercolor was the first activity that he really undertook because he started out studying to be an architect, and watercolor is used many times by people studying architecture and by architects for enhancing and filling in detail of architectural drawings. A lot of times architectural drawings will be rendered in pen or pencil or some sort of graphic medium, and then the watercolor washes will give an atmosphere and give a stronger sense of space so that you can imagine the architectural form through the watercolor. So this is the direction that he came to watercolor. And I know that he started out as a watercolor painter, and very early in the 1930s won a prize for his watercolors. And so I think that was a signal to him that he was moving in the right direction. So watercolor, I think, again, occupies an important place in his career, although I think that he's become better known for his oils.
My father said to me when I first took up painting, he was in the brokerage business or I wouldn't be here now, he said to me, "Wallace, you do just what you want. I'll give you a certain amount of money and you work hard at it. I insist on that. But if you do, something may come of it."
Wally photographed Paris and attended classes at the École des Beaux-Arts to advance his knowledge of watercolors.
We were very young. We had very little money, but we did scrape up enough money to buy a little car with a 2 horsepower or something. And every weekend when I was done pretending that I was doing work at the bazaar where I did do some work, we'd climb in there and go out into the countryside. And it was all so beautiful with the orangey roofs and everything, and just take long trips and then come back to Paris. It is the most beauty. You can't describe the French countryside.
Most notably during the Paris years was the birth of their only child, Jay, in 1927.
I often look back at their life and their moving around and whatnot, and I'm not sure there was too much planning in any of it. Jay was born in Paris, but that was just that point in time, and then they came back.
The sudden death of Wally's father, Jay, in 1928 prompted their return to St. Louis.
We hated to come back. I think if Wally's father had not died, we would probably have stayed over there.
Wally and Kels returned to St. Louis heavy-hearted and determined to build a career. Wally's family became his clients.
Wally was working for LeBaume and Klein in the late 20s, and they were one of the leading fashionable architectural firms in St. Louis during that period. Louis LeBaume was also a member of St. Louis Society and was on the board of the St. Louis Art Museum, and so he was considered one of the leaders of the profession in St. Louis. And he was an eclectic architect, and although people said he never lifted a pencil himself, he had good designers on staff, and his partner Eugene Klein was a good designer of various period revival styles. So the house that Wally designed for his mother came right out of that tradition. It was what we now sometimes call French eclectic, derived from the late 17th and early 18th century houses of France, which of course he loved anyway. And it's characterized by the very high mansard roof and rounded door and other features characteristic of French houses of that period. But it's one of the best houses of this era, I would say.
My grandmother owned the first lot, the second lot, and the third lot. She owned all the lots on one side of that lane. And Uncle Wally built his own house up there early on, which became the Culver's house. And then he went on to New York, I guess. And, but Uncle Bob kept the next lot. We had a victory garden there in World War II, and then Uncle Bob built his house. And the bottom one went to, the youngest child, Mom.
The Smith family bought this property off Price Road in the early 20s, and it actually had space for 3 very large houses. This house was built by Wally for his sister Taffy, and it's one of his best designs. It's federal style with beautiful fan lights over the door and over the side. The fine detailing of the windows you can see with hinged shutters again, and the very massive chimney at the west end of it. It sits very beautifully at the top of a rise, but it's informal in its massing, which was typical of the so-called country club style of that era, as opposed to the kind of palatial houses that were in the city.
I'd always take him to see the one on Fielding Road, which his friend Bud Culver lived in at that time. That house since has been torn down. He was very proud of that house, and he talked about how it had 12-inch brick walls and how what a solid foundation he'd been. He was very proud of those two houses, and we went to see him quite often, maybe once a week.
While the couple lived in St. Louis, Wally was transitioning from architecture to painting.
Of course, there was wonderful Louis Le Bon, who was an architect. He used to paint with him.
Louis Le Bon was my closest friend. He lived to be 89 years old. I worked for him as an architect once, and I painted him standing in the same studio we've just discussed against the light a few years before he died. This painting is a little different and a little earlier than some of the others. Notice when I'm after. Notice that I'm after the gesture in his hand, the whole gesture of the body, to make the thing seem lifelike and real. The color is muted, but I think it expresses Louis as well as any portrait expresses anybody that I've ever done.
And then, of course, dear Fred Conway. They were very great friends. Not that they paint exactly alike, but they respected each other's way of painting and respected each other as painters. They had a very painterly friendship. They talked about painting a lot.
He and Fred Conway not only became painting buddies, they became drinking buddies, and they'd always, as Wally said, celebrate the completion of a good piece of artwork with a bottle of scotch. So I think Fred Conway and he painting together helped him weather the storm here in St. Louis.
No, I don't think anyone in St. Louis has understood him, except for Fred Conway and Louis Le Bon. Nobody else has really understood what it means to be a painter, that you dedicate your life to it.
They would get together, a bunch of them, on about once a week and paint, just for the camaraderie and the stimulation and whatnot. Zeke Pettis, Jane Pettis was in the group, Louis Le Bon, a couple of others. But I think the whole family really endorsed that architecture thing as a great way to go. And when the Depression came and there was no more work, you had to do something else.
My father said, if you take up painting, you won't make a penny.
I thought he was a good painter. Well, you couldn't stop him anyway. He was determined to paint, and there was absolutely no stopping him. I must say that from the start, he was a good painter.
Before moving to New York, Wally began showing his artwork at the City Museum and the St. Louis Art Museum in 1932 and 1933.
Smith was coming at an interesting time in the development of American art, a peculiarly American art. He was at that transition point. He was coming of age as a painter in that transition point between regionalism, this style that emphasizes realism, and the transition to abstract art, which of course made New York the center of the art world starting in the 1940s and beyond. And Smith was a sort of bridge, time-wise, chronologically, between those two movements in American art, the realist movement and the movement into abstraction.
New York helped strengthen Wally's technique.
I remember Alexander Brooke way back, years ago. He said, but Smitty, you leave all your darks out. You gotta have dark pushing something behind it out, or vice versa, in order to get some vitality into the painting. It mustn't be flat. After I studied with Brooke at the League for some time, he said, Smitty, you're doing fine, getting along all right, but you ought to change partners and study at least for a little bit with somebody else. And I said, who do you suggest? And he said, Thomas Benton. And I said, oh God, I don't crave his work, but I'll do it.
He was extremely well versed in theory. He knew more about modern art than probably any of his contemporaries. He went to Paris. He went to museums. He did his research. But very interestingly, he was just not one to change or to follow a trend or a fashion. He stayed committed to his ideals and to the project of rendering form solidly on the canvas and unifying it and making it a delightful composition to behold.
It was here at the Art Students League where Wally became friends with Jackson Pollock.
Pollock tried to get Wally to come over to the extreme abstract position where he was, if I may, dribbling paint and whatnot on canvases and doing this, and it was a big hit. It became quite popular. And Jackson Pollock said, Wally, you gotta come on over. He says, this is really, really simple. They give you all kinds of money for it, and there are booze and broads around, and it's really a good time, and you just gotta do this. And Uncle Wally said, Jack, I just can't.
Influenced by European art and architecture, Smith spent a lifetime developing his craft, guided by the influence of Rembrandt, Goya, and Matisse.
Remember the statement Matisse said, I want a picture that I can sit down in a chair at the end of the day, and even if it's a Matisse or what it is, it can help me and help me relax. That's Matisse. That's what I wanted. I didn't get it the way he did, but that's what I wanted. I wanted that simplicity.
He was really, really interested in modernist artists, particularly French modernist artists. He loved Matisse. As much as he was interested in some of the French modernist painters, he never went as far as they did in terms of experimentation with color and with the loosening up of form.
You don't like to say it because you don't want people to think you're a know-it-all. So many friends turn to abstraction painting only. And who am I to tell somebody how to paint? I'm just a different jib, as we say in sailing. It's not made for me. I have a simpler, straightforward way.
It may be one of the reasons why Wally Smith is not better known, because he continued on in this realist style, starting in the 1930s and then all the way through throughout his career, and he never became interested in radical abstract experimentation. So he was slightly out of fashion at the time in American art, which is not to say that he was not a great artist. I think in many ways his dedication to his craft makes him stand out among any of the realist painters of the 20th century in the United States. I have never seen a body of work that represented such steadfast commitment to the kinds of artistic ideals that he was interested in.
Although Wally worked for Alexander Brooke, his greater friendship was with Peggy Bacon, especially after 1940 when Brooke and Bacon divorced. And in 1939, Peggy Bacon enticed Wally to join her as an instructor at the Tyler School of Fine Arts in Philadelphia.
Wally was never a part, really, of the art world. Those 4 years at Princeton really kept him from being a part of the art world in New York. They were important years when they were all just starting and painting. Alex Brooke, McPhee, Hopper.
I think it's very interesting that Smith's experience in New York wasn't all that productive. He didn't really fit in among the artists, even in the 1930s and 40s, even among artists who were doing work that you could compare to Smith's.
We didn't know enough about New York in the beginning, so he started at a school uptown. We really should have been downtown, As it was, we were neither fish nor fowl. We were halfway.
There was a general idea throughout the 19th and 20th centuries that great art comes from struggle. Artists like Van Gogh serve as the model, poor, despairing, unpopular. This extends to American artists in the 1930s and 1940s when artistic expressionism was prioritized, and the idea was that artists had more to express if they were facing greater challenges.
He had the privilege of being able to, travel the world and paint, in places and things that, the average person, the average artist in New York would not have been able to do. They would not have been able to, hop on a ship and go live in Paris or, travel Europe and do the things that he did. So I think that absolutely it had to have influenced his work that he did. And I think probably from a personal standpoint, he had that comfort knowing that financially things were taken care of.
I don't think that you can just attribute Smith's commitment to his art to the fact that he didn't have to work for a living otherwise. I really don't know of another painter who stayed so single-minded and so consistent to his style and to his interests than Smith. I think that he would have produced the same kinds of paintings regardless of the background that he came from, regardless of how much he had to struggle or how little he had to struggle to support himself.
No, it was never easy for him. In fact, people have said to me, what a wonderful thing to have, such a hobby as being able to paint like this. But it's never been a hobby. It's been his life blood. It's the same as a woman having a baby who conceives it. She goes through the period of gestation, and then she produces it. And the whole thing is very painful. And all of it is very painful. All of these pictures. I don't think they show the pain behind them.
He was a very controlled, disciplined kind of painter. I like to think of him as the most workmanlike painter I know of. He did studies, he took photographs, he devoted himself to the visual world and rendering it. He did nothing offhandedly or quickly or without the utmost consideration for its structure and its weight. He was just a very deliberate painter and very, very serious, and someone that I admire for that reason.
He has a good sense of design. There's a good sense of layout with Wally's paintings. There's a logic to them. There's a coherent composition. He knows what goes where on the page, as it were. And he also has a very, very good sense of when a painting is done. One of the problems, in my opinion, that so many artists have is they put too much information on the page. They don't know when the artwork is finished. Wally has an unerring sense of when the painting is finished. And I think people respond to that. There's a wonderful logic and a coherence in Wally's work.
Well, it's always hurt him a lot because he realizes that people think that he's playing. It's true, he's always laughed about his pictures and made fun of them. But that was a protective covering. Due to the fact that people have made so much fun of his pictures and of him painting, so that he reacted and made fun of them himself. But that was only a protective covering, because when people would stab at his paintings, it was as if they had kicked him upstairs.
Wally would ultimately exhibit over a dozen times in New York City. A lift of confidence came one evening from renowned artist Edward Hopper.
Well, Mr. Hopper, was the sort of quintessential poor, struggling artist that became hugely successful. But Edward Hopper came in and a kind of a hush fell over the place, and he climbs up the stairs and whatnot, and Uncle Wally sort of runs to greet him. It didn't come across as being on a first name basis. It was Mr. Hopper. And he was older, of course, but he came in, and they had about 4 rooms on the third floor or something of the Wren Gallery. Mr. Hopper went around and he would study the paintings and go to the next room, and he would go all the way around without really making any kind of a remark at all. And when he got to the end of it, with Uncle Wally right behind him the whole way, he turned to him and he said, "Not bad, Smith, not bad." I've thought about that phrase many times, not bad. It's a pretty nice recommendation coming from Edward Hopper.
I thought that was an interesting sidelight, that he could have been, if he had been a little bit earlier, he would have been accepted more. I think the fact that he was a college graduate too also kept him away from the mainstream. After all, a different level of education, I think a broader point of view, probably as a result.
As the threat of war loomed on the horizon, Wally's brother Robert urged a return to St. Louis. During the war, Wally almost immediately began exhibiting at the City Museum and the St. Louis Art Museum.
After the war, we stayed in St. Louis, and I thought it was too bad that we didn't go back to New York. But Wally pointed out the fact that he was really better off in St. Louis because he was without influence from fellow painters. He wasn't under the pressure that he was in New York. And also, Wally has this other side, you see. He's a nervous actor. He can pull over a song if he's accompanied. He can put over a song as well as anybody I've ever heard on stage.
I mean, every opportunity that you can possibly imagine, he turned into a production par excellence, which was just fun for everybody.
He was an outdoorsman. He loved golf, hunting, tennis, and fishing.
So my grandmother was always very, probably overly protective of me. So I think she was always a little worried anytime I'd get in the brown Torino with Wally and take off. And one summer, I don't remember how old I was. I was probably, I don't know, maybe 10 or 11. So we were in the boat. We had these little rowboats in the trout pond, and he was up there casting and hooked me behind the ear, and on the swing out, literally almost threw me out of the boat. And so I yelled and I probably cried a little bit, and he got the hook out of my ear. And driving back, he probably said 3 or 4 times, "Don't you tell your grandmother that this happened, because if you do, we're never going fishing again."
Wally and Kels cherished time with friends.
Pulitzer was awfully good to him. The exposure that he got, in the rotogravure and the Sunday papers and whatnot, plus the friendship that they had. They would go hunting down in Arkansas. On numerous occasions, they'd get on Joe's DC-3, and away they'd go. And they'd shoot ducks, or they would wind up, sometimes I can remember he would be in Florida. And Uncle Wally said, we stopped in Atlanta on the way back. It was such a long trip, we had to get gas. So I thought the least I could do was fill up the tanks. So I said to the pilot, "Hey, this one's on me." And the pilot said, "Give me $640. And Uncle Wally said, "I'm sorry I even brought it up." I mean, they had good times, and Joe Pulitzer was a Uncle Wally promoter. And the family bought that self-portrait of Uncle Wally for $10,000 way back when.
And that's the strange thing, because I painted that in almost an effortless way, just in the North Light. I stood there and my legs felt pretty good that day, and I painted away for 4 or 5 hours, and I knew that I had the structure then, above which I put any little details which I wanted, but there weren't many. And I worked on that for only about 4 or 5 hours. I sold it for a good price, unexpectedly. A 47 by 36 canvas. It was so ridiculous. I didn't make any gestures, I just looked myself, which makes me begin to wonder what I do look like.
Wally didn't get a rise out of portraits.
My things didn't look or feel like the people I was painting, and they wanted them that way. Pretty girls wanted to be roughed up and dashed up and look a little fancier, and I didn't have that desire.
Instead, he moved toward familiar landscapes.
For years, we've had a home up at Harbor Springs, Michigan, which is up near the Canadian border. It's a beautiful spot. We live in an old house that Mother left to us looking down over the lake, surrounded with pine trees. Down below, I have a studio in the woods, which we built in the days when I was an architect. I have naturally, having been there for some 50 or 60 years, observed the lake, all the inhabitants, the little town, which is full of Indians, but I have observed particularly the mood of the lake. The lake is different from the ocean. It is quiet. I often think when I wake up in the morning of Indians in their old birch bark canoes paddling around the lake and of the campfires that went on in those days. However, those days are gone, and now I paint the lake, for its moods have hardly changed. There's still the old Indian church there, by the lake, surrounded with the dark trees.
It was the one constant, if you will, in his life. It's a beautiful place and very conducive to painting. I mean, there's a lot, and his work reflects that, a lot of beautiful things to paint. He, again, loved the water. We talked, he loves sailing, and so a lot of his art are sailing scenes, water scenes. So yeah, I think that that was a huge part, huge influence.
There's something about being in contact with the elements out on the sea, and particularly in a race when the water is splashing all over you and everything, and you wonder where it all came from.
He represents this area in a way that is so palatable to me. There are other people who paint here now, and most of it's too cute for me. I don't like cute. This is deep and real to me. So.
Here I sit at the old table in the glass room overlooking the water, just as I used to a year ago. It's really the most beautiful spot imaginable, especially at sundown, when I can look far across the water and see the faint blush of the west mellow all the coming darkness. Not a sound except the lazy lapping of the water on the shore and the faint whistle sailing away to it, haven under the hill. The pine trees around the cottage rise heavenwards, like the slow curling smoke from a dying campfire.
I know that Harbor Springs was a place where he really, I think he really would go to refresh himself and go to refresh his ideas and to take maybe a little bit of a break from painting and to entertain friends. And you can see how much of his life and how much of his own energy and his own interests are rooted in this place by his sailboat paintings.
Practically all of my work has been done here. We're going way back. And if you examine the work more carefully, you'll see that most of it's pictures of sailboats and the water around here. It's also interesting to notice that I made some progress in this line. Having worked on it for so many years, I kind of feel like I'm on a boat at times.
A lot of his inspiration came in Harbor Springs because a lot of the scenes of waterscapes or landscapes are scenes from his house in Harbor Springs, or a house that his mother bought. While he liked Harbor Springs, he thought it was an inspiration to him. He loved to take his easels and his paints and his brushes, and when he could, walk around or drive around the countryside and find places to paint. He was very well liked up there, and years ago he'd tell me about how socially he just blended in. He was always the life of the party, more or less, at the parties in Harbor Springs.
I think they had a pretty good time up here because he had an audience here. He had Wequatancy and Harbor Springs, with originally a smattering of St. Louis people, but then they knew people from all over the place, and he sold some paintings to some friends and admirers too.
It just captured the essence of this place. It was real. It wasn't so perfect. It has great depth. It has great emotion. But it has the beauty of the town, and the town is a beautiful place with beautiful people in it. The church has a serenity about it. It's a place I love to go, that particular church. And it's just, had everything.
Wally painted for nearly 60 years. Moonlight Sail is a staple in Smith's collection.
Now here we have something that's different. Here's a different mood of the lake. Here's a very simple composition with a sailboat headed out into the moonlight, and very little in it itself, but it has a mood of quiet. How could you paint a moonlight sail other than that? It's the quiet pervasiveness of the scene that I think makes it important. Every inch of the canvas is adjusted. The moon, I trust, is in exactly the right place. It's been moved several times. The simple canvas extends high into the painting. The color is extremely restricted and low in key. On the other hand, I feel there's a great sense of color, because to me, color, which is the most important thing in a painting, is not necessarily a matter of colors, but of various areas. I think this painting shows that perhaps as well as any other that I have.
More often than not, he's got really dynamic lines in his sailing scenes. This one, for example, this is a beautiful scene that is a vertical format with horizontal bands of the sky and the land and the sea, and yet right in the middle of it, he's sort of knife-like dropped this mast, which just cuts right through with a diagonal and really just shifts the entire energy of the entire canvas.
After the war, Wally and Kels resumed their long-duration travels in France. Wally found inspiration seen in scores of personal photographs and sketches. He visited museums and continued to study his art. The highest exposure came in 1953 at a show in Paris.
Paris bought a picture of mine called Snow in Clayton. I took 35 pictures over that I did a couple of days before we went on the boat, and it was of my studio in the snow. And they were all so surprised. But they don't see as much snow as we do to know how it feels.
And especially something, a scene so hometown, as you said, a scene right outside of his studio window, making its way back to France. You know, the place where he goes to study and to be inspired and to look at small towns and just, just incidental everyday scenes in France. That's so inspirational to him. And for his own everyday scene, a scene of, something that he sees all the time out his studio window, to have traveled in the other direction, that must have been so, so thrilling.
When it became too difficult, it was sad, because that was his life, and he would complain about his eyesight, was bad, and that he couldn't hold a brush or something like that. It was kind of sad, because it took away a lot of time that, the time that he spent painting, he would then now spend just sitting or watching television or something like that. It was truly sad, and I guess that's really all I can say. It was a sad situation. One of the things we used to do once a week, we'd go to the art museum, and even with failing memory and failing mind, if Wally saw a piece of work by a Monet or a Matisse or a Manet, from across the room, he could tell you what that was.
Wallace Herndon Smith died in the winter of 1990.
You know, to me, he was just, you know, Wally, and he was going to always be there, you know. And so I think I'd gone with my kids down to the Lake of the Ozarks for some dance competition they were having, and I got a call at the hotel down there. I said, nobody knows I'm here, and it was one of the nurses said, you better come back. You know, Wallace Smith just died, you know. It was a sudden death of Wally to me, you know, because, you know, I was used to us hanging out 3 times a week or just driving around. He just like get in the car and drive around sometimes. So for him to die while I was out of town, and then, you know, and then he was gone. So it wasn't like a long sickness or nothing. He just got a cold that developed into pneumonia, and then he passed away.
I don't know how important recognition for his art was. I think he did it because he enjoyed it, and I know that you know, the way he interacted with people, he liked to be around people that were fun and were laughing and having a good time. He liked to have a good time, and so I think, you know, he probably would want people to remember him that way.
Artists don't really very often get to be famous during their lifetimes. For whatever reasons, there has to be a passage of time for people to come in and kind of reevaluate it.
Boy, he sort of covered the waterfront there. He got a lot of canvases out there. I mean, he stayed true to his principles, and whether or not that satisfied him or not, I really can't say.
He's never deviated from his goal that he had, which was to express what he had to, what was in himself. And he shunned that when people said he was a fool to have given that up. Going on Broadway, you would have been a great success. Now look what you do. Just paint. You could have been a successful man. You're just nothing but an artist now.
I think that before he died, he felt that he was beginning to get some recognition as an artist, and that made him happy.
Well, those that own him love him and don't want to give him up, which is probably why he's not well known, because there hasn't been anything that's come on the market for sale in auction. If you are lucky enough to have a Wally Smith, I don't want to give it up. And my children have fallen in love with them too. They're very special. But if it can just bring the joy to other people that it's been brought to me, then that's wonderful. And perhaps he could be really important because he's so good at what he does, was so good at what he did.
If history is going to go back and sort of right a wrong, I think it's going to go back and notice that through all of the other fashions that came and went in the 20th century, in the history of American painting, Smith never strayed from his course, and he just remained a very, very, very solid, very passionate, very passionate painter. And I have to imagine that history is going to eventually give him his due. I hope so anyway. He's really an extraordinary painter, I think.
Wallace Herndon Smith was a 20th century artist, period. Whether he was acting, writing plays, or composing music, designing and sketching houses, taking photographs, or painting watercolors and oils, he remained consistently an artist.
This is just me. It's taken my life to find out what color I wanted. It's taken me my life. I have not jumped like Don Quixote, jumped on a horse and galloped off in all directions. I've stuck to one way. To what extent it's good or not, we never seem to know in our own lives.
Drifting on the sea, lost in shadows, sailing silently. shroud her, let on clouds becloud her. May my dream ship come again to me. All the ships that pass in the night for havens far and lands out of sight, like maidens we have known of yore, soon vanish to be seen no more. They bow and smile, then fade in the darkness. Oh,